They told me to clean out my desk by noon, 3 days before the company I built would be worth 9 figures. They were smiling. They had no idea the entire IPO was about to stop, and that the only person who could restart it had just been escorted to the elevator. The 44th floor of the Helix Therapeutics Tower in Midtown Manhattan had a particular kind of silence on the morning they decided to erase me. Not the comfortable silence of focus, but the engineered quiet of a building designed to make people feel small. Glass walls from floor to ceiling, the East River glinting cold and indifferent below, the hum of climate control that never let you forget someone else controlled the temperature of your day. I had walked that hallway every morning for 6 years. I knew which floor tile clicked, which conference room smelled faintly of stale blue bottle coffee, which elevator was always slow. I knew the building the way you know a body you've kept alive. My name is Sloane Whitfield. I was the chief of staff to the CEO and, on paper, the head of regulatory affairs. Though the title undersold what I actually did, which was hold the entire pre-IPO machine together with both hands while everyone above me took the photos. I was 41 years old that February morning, and I had spent the last 3 years of my life turning a struggling biotech into something Wall Street was about to value at over $4 billion. I just didn't know yet that the people I'd built it for had already decided I wouldn't be in the room when it happened. It started, as these things always do, with a calendar invite. 9 a.m. Quick alignment, leadership transition. No agenda. Sent at 6:47 the night before by Marcus Vail, our CEO, a man who had joined 18 months ago with a tan that didn't match the season and a habit of saying, "Let's not overcomplicate it," whenever someone raised a problem that might cost him sleep. I'd flagged the vague invite, the odd timing, the fact that general counsel was CC'd. I'd told myself I was being paranoid. I'm an observant person by nature. It's what made me good at regulatory work, the ability to notice the one clause in a 40-page filing that would sink you. But observation only protects you if you let yourself believe what you see. I walked into that conference room with a folder under my arm the way I always did. Inside it were the final S1 amendments, the documents that would take Helix public in 72 hours. I'd been working on them until 1 a.m. Marcus didn't ask me to sit. "Sloane," he said, with the warmth of a man reading a name off a parking ticket, "we're restructuring the leadership team ahead of the offering. The board feels the public company phase needs a different profile at the top of regulatory and operations." He slid a single sheet of paper across the glass. "We're going to part ways. Today, effective immediately." I have replayed that moment more times than I'd like to admit, and what strikes me now isn't the cruelty, it's the laziness of it. He didn't even look up while he ended 6 years of my life. Beside him sat Diane Foster from HR, her expression arranged into the practiced softness of someone who has delivered this speech before and will deliver it again. And in the corner, not speaking, was a man I half recognized, younger, sharp suit, the kind of confidence that comes pre-installed. Marcus's nephew, I'd later confirm, the one taking my office. "Can I ask why now?" I said. My voice came out level. It surprised even me. 3 days before the IPO, with the S1 still open. Marcus finally looked at me, and there it was, the flicker of irritation that powerful men get when the furniture talks back. "The filings are handled. Legal has it. This isn't a negotiation, Sloane. It's a courtesy meeting." He tapped the paper. "Your severance reflects your time here. We're being more than fair." I glanced down. The number on the page was insulting in a very specific, calculated way. It was structured to make me sign quickly and leave quietly. And buried in the paragraph beneath it, I caught it in a single scan, the way you catch a typo on a billboard. It was a forfeiture clause, my equity, my options. The package that, in 3 days, would convert into something worth more than everything I'd earned in my entire career combined. They weren't firing me to clean up the org chart. They were firing me to take it. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the old familiar urge to argue, to lay out the 17 reasons this was wrong, to make them see me. And then, just as quickly, something colder settled over it. Because in that half second of scanning the severance sheet, my mind had already done what it always did. It had flipped to the documents in my folder, to the S1, to a single sentence buried in the underwriting schedule that Marcus, in 18 months, had never bothered to read. I closed the folder. Of course, I said quietly. I understand. Diane visibly relaxed. Marcus gave a small nod, the matter already behind him, already onto lunch. Diane will walk you through the paperwork. Badge and laptop stay. We appreciate everything. We appreciate everything. The 4 words they hand you when they want to make sure you know you were never anything at all. I stood, smoothed the front of my coat, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Marcus already pivoting to his nephew, his voice warming back to its natural register. Okay, so once she's out, the IPO morning run of show is. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. Because what none of them knew, not Marcus, not Diane, not the boy in the corner measuring my office for new furniture, was that 11 months ago, when Helix was bleeding cash and no underwriter would touch us, the deal had been restructured around a single regulatory authorization, a federal certification tied to our lead drug candidate, a signatory authority that the SEC and our lead bank, Goldman, both required to be held by one named individual at the company. That name wasn't Marcus Vale. That name was mine. And in 72 hours, the most important financial event in the history of Helix Therapeutics was scheduled to close on a signature that had just been escorted to the elevator. What I did in the next 48 hours, I did calmly on my own laptop from my own apartment with the door closed. And it began the moment those elevator doors slid shut, and I realized they had handed me the one thing they thought they were taking away. The elevator ride down 44 floors gave me exactly enough time to decide what kind of person I was going to be about this. There are 2 versions of every woman who gets walked out of a building. The first one cries in the lobby, calls a friend, posts something dignified and wounded online, and spends the next 6 months explaining to recruiters why she left for new opportunities. I had nothing against her. I'd been her briefly a long time ago. But she wasn't useful to me today. Today I needed the other one. The one who reads the underwriting schedule for fun, who keeps her own records, and who knows that in finance, the loudest person in the room is almost never the one holding the leverage. By the time the doors opened onto the marble lobby, I had stopped feeling anything at all. I'd later recognize this as a kind of grace. The mind goes quiet so the work can begin. I didn't take a car home. I walked 12 blocks through a freezing February morning, the wind coming off the Hudson like it had a personal grievance. Yellow cabs hissed through gray slush. I let the cold sharpen me. By the time I reached my apartment on the Upper West Side, the plan had already assembled itself, not as revenge. I want to be precise about that, because what came later was never about revenge, but as a simple sequence of facts that needed to be put in front of the right people, in the right order. The first thing I did was open my personal laptop. Not the company one. They'd kept that, along with my badge, with the smug confidence of people who think access lives in hardware. Access doesn't live in hardware. It lives in signatures, certifications, and the law. And all 3 of those had walked out of the building with me. Here is what Marcus Vale didn't understand, because understanding it would have required him to read something longer than a press release. 11 months earlier, Helix had been 3 weeks from insolvency. Our lead candidate, a respiratory therapeutic, was the only thing keeping investors interested, and it sat under a specialized federal manufacturing and regulatory authorization. When we restructured the company to make it viable for a public offering, the SEC's review and Goldman's underwriting committee had both required something specific: that the named authorized regulatory signatory, the individual legally certifying that our lead asset's compliance status was accurate and current, be a single identifiable officer of the company. Not a department, not a title that could be reassigned with a memo. A named human being on file, whose personal certification the entire S1 leaned on. I had argued at the time that this was a structural risk. I'd recommended we build a redundancy, a second authorized signatory, so the company would never be exposed to a single point of failure. Marcus, newly arrived, eager to look decisive, had waved it off. Less cooks, cleaner kitchen, he'd said. He liked phrases that sounded like wisdom and cost nothing to say. So the kitchen had one cook. Me. I sat at my kitchen table, the radiator ticking, And I did not send a single angry email. I want you to understand the discipline of that because it was the hardest part. Every instinct screamed to fire off a message to the board, to Marcus, to anyone, laying out exactly how badly he'd just stepped on a rake. But a message like that is a tantrum, and a tantrum is evidence of someone who can be managed. I didn't want to be managed. I wanted to be correct, in writing, in a way that could not be argued with. So instead, I made my first quiet move. I opened a clean document and I drafted a single professional notification, the kind so calm it's almost boring. It was addressed to the company's general counsel and to the lead underwriting contact at Goldman, the banker who'd run our deal for months and who, unlike Marcus, knew exactly what my name meant on that filing. His name was Daniel Cho, a managing director who measured his words like they were billed by the syllable. The notification said, in essence, as of this morning, my employment with Helix Therapeutics has been terminated, effective immediately. Per the regulatory authorization on file with the Commission and referenced in Section 9 of the underwriting agreement, I am the named authorized signatory for the lead assets compliance certification. I am writing to confirm the company's plan for maintaining a valid current certification through the offering, given my departure. That was it. No accusation, no threat. Just a question that, the moment Daniel Cho read it, would detonate silently across two of the most cautious institutions in American finance. I read it 4 times. Then I saved it as a draft. I did not send it yet. Timing in matters like this is everything. Send it too early, and Marcus has 72 hours to find a workaround, to pressure me, to manufacture some emergency reassignment that lawyers could fight about for months. Send it too late, and I'd look like I was sabotaging a deal out of spite. There was a precise window, after the board believed I was gone and forgotten, but before the final pricing call with the underwriters, when that one email would land like a stone through glass. I closed the laptop and made myself a cup of tea, and that was when my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize, a 212 area code. I let it go to voicemail, the old habit of a woman who has learned that nothing good is delivered by a surprise call before noon. A minute later, the transcription appeared on my screen, and I felt the first genuine flicker of something since the elevator. It was Daniel Cho, from Goldman, the underwriter. Sloane. It's Daniel. I'm hearing some things from the Helix side about a leadership change this morning, and I want to make sure I understand the certification situation before our pricing call. Can you give me a ring back today? Soon, ideally. Thanks. I set the phone down very gently on the table. They hadn't told the bank. Marcus had fired the one person whose signature the entire $4 billion offering legally depended on. And in his rush to install his nephew and pocket my equity, he had not stopped to inform the underwriters that the named signatory on their deal had just been walked to an elevator. The bank was finding out sideways, from rumor, 3 days before pricing. I almost laughed, not from satisfaction, from the sheer vertiginous size of the mistake. Marcus thought he'd cut a department head loose. What he'd actually done was pull a single load-bearing bolt out of a structure with $4 billion sitting on top of it, and then walk away whistling. I still hadn't sent my email. I didn't need to yet. Because Daniel Cho was already asking the question for me, and the most powerful thing I could do in that moment was the one thing Marcus had never once managed in 18 months at the top of my company. I could tell the truth calmly when they asked. I picked the phone back up, looked at Daniel's number, and let the cursor of my own judgment hover over it for a long moment. There was a version of this where I called him back immediately and let the whole thing crack open that afternoon. And there was a version where I waited just long enough to make sure that when the truth came out, it came out in a room I had chosen, in front of the people who needed to see it, including a man who, in 72 hours, was going to find out that the woman he hadn't bothered to look at while firing was the only signature standing between him and the biggest day of his life. I knew exactly which version I wanted, and it required me to make one phone call first. Not to Goldman, not to the board, but to a person whose name was not on any Helix org chart and whose involvement Marcus Vail could never in 100 years have predicted. Let me pause right here because the next 48 hours are the part I almost didn't tell anyone. But first, I need to ask you something. If you just walked out of that building, would you have called the bank back that same afternoon and let it all crack open? Or would you have waited the way I did for the right room? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're still with me, subscribe. Because the person I called next was never on that company's payroll, and Marcus never saw them coming. By the time I made my first real move, the city outside my window had gone dark, and Helix Therapeutics still had no idea the ground had already shifted beneath it. The person I called was not a lawyer, though I had one of those too. The person I called was a woman named Margot Lindqvist, and to understand why she mattered, you have to understand what kind of relationship survives in a city like New York, where everyone is transactional until the one time they aren't. Margot had been the lead regulatory counsel at the federal level, not at Helix, but on the government side, during the original certification of our lead asset 11 months earlier. She was the person who had reviewed, line by line, the compliance authorization that the entire offering now leaned on. She had since left public service for a white shoe firm in the financial district, the kind with a reception floor that smells like money and silence. We weren't friends exactly. We were something more durable than friends in this business. Two competent women who had each watched the other refuse to cut a corner under pressure and had quietly filed that away as worth remembering. When she picked up, she didn't waste a syllable. "Sloane, I heard. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it in a way that surprised her, I think. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong." "Go." "The lead assets compliance certification, the one that's referenced in the S1 and the underwriting agreement. As of this morning, I am no longer an officer of the company. Walk me through what that means for a valid certification at pricing." There was a pause. The specific pause of an expert assembling the architecture of a problem in her head before she speaks. "It means," Margot said slowly, "that the certification on file is now attached to an individual who has no authority to maintain or update it because she's no longer employed there. Which means at the moment of pricing, the company's representation that its lead assets compliance status is currently and accurately certified by an authorized officer is, at minimum, stale. At worst, it's no longer true. And a representation that's no longer true, in an S1, 3 days before an offering, is a material misstatement," I finished. "Is a material problem," she corrected gently, which is a phrase that makes underwriters and the commission lose the ability to sleep. Another pause. "Sloane, do they know?" "The bank found out by rumor this afternoon. The board, I don't think, has any idea yet." I heard her exhale through her nose, the closest Margot Lindqvist ever came to a laugh. "He fired the signatory and didn't tell the underwriters." "He didn't read the underwriting agreement," I said. "He never reads anything longer than a press release. Then he's about to read something very short and very expensive." She shifted into the register I'd called her for. Clean, procedural, devastating. "Here's where you stand, and I want you to hear this carefully because it matters. You have done nothing wrong. You haven't sabotaged anything. You haven't withheld anything. You were terminated, and your departure created a structural defect in their offering that they created by firing you. Your only obligation now is to respond truthfully and promptly if the company, the bank, or the commission asks you about your status. You are not required to volunteer to fix a problem they made, and you are absolutely not required to certify anything for a company that no longer employs you." I closed my eyes. That was the sentence I'd needed to hear out loud from someone whose name carried weight. Not permission. I didn't need permission. Confirmation that the cleanest, most lawful path and the most powerful one were, in this rare and beautiful instance, exactly the same path. "There's one more thing," Margot said. "If they come to you, and they will the second the bank forces the issue, they're going to try to make this fast and quiet. They'll offer to reinstate you on paper just long enough to sign, or they'll dangle the severance and hope you panic. Don't sign anything in a hurry. Not the severance, not a reinstatement, nothing. Every document they put in front of you in the next 72 hours is a document they need more than you do. Make them say that out loud." "I know," I said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway, because smart people sign things when they're scared, And they made you scared this morning on purpose. Her voice softened by exactly 1 degree. Send me the severance sheet. I'll have eyes on it tonight. I forwarded it to her before we hung up. That was my second quiet move, and it cost me nothing. But it meant that by 10 o'clock that night, one of the sharpest regulatory minds in the country had read the document Helix had used to try to strip my equity and had circled in her own notes the forfeiture clause they'd buried in paragraph 4. I did not sleep much, but I didn't pace either. I lay in the dark and ran the sequence forward, the way I used to run filings. Where's the next pressure point? Who moves next? What do they assume? Where are they wrong? The next morning at 7:40, my phone rang again. Daniel Cho, the underwriter. I let it ring twice this time, then answered. Sloane. His voice had changed since the voicemail. The careful syllable counting was still there, but underneath it ran a current I recognized. The controlled urgency of a man whose deal was developing a crack he could not yet measure. Thank you for picking up. I'll be direct. We're hearing your role at Helix ended yesterday. I need to understand the certification status on the lead asset before we go anywhere near pricing on Thursday. Can you confirm your status for me? And here was the moment. I could feel its weight. Everything I did next had to be true, had to be calm, and had to be entirely his question driving it, not my grievance. Daniel, and I said, I want to be careful and accurate with you because I respect the position you're in. As of yesterday morning, Helix terminated my employment, effective immediately. I'm no longer an officer of the company. I'm the named authorized signatory on the lead assets compliance certification referenced in the underwriting agreement and the S1. I haven't been asked by the company to maintain, update, or re-execute that certification, and as a former employee, I'm no longer in a position to do so on their behalf. The silence on the other end of the line was the most expensive silence I have ever heard. I could practically hear him doing the math. The certification, the timeline, the representation in the S1, the commission, the pricing call, the $4 billion, all of it rearranging itself into a single, unavoidable conclusion. They terminated you, he said finally, very quietly, and didn't tell us you were the signatory. I'm telling you now, I said, because you asked. Another pause. Then, with the careful neutrality of a man who has just realized he is going to have to ruin someone's morning. Sloane, I'm going to need you to stay reachable today. I have to take this to our committee, and I suspect Helix's counsel is going to be calling you within hours. I'd strongly advise you to have your own representation. A beat. Do you? I thought of Margot's notes, already circling paragraph 4. I do, I said. I hung up, set the phone face down on the kitchen table, and looked out the window at the gray morning light over the rooftops. Somewhere across town, on the 44th floor, Marcus Vale was probably reviewing the IPO run of show with his nephew, rehearsing the speech he'd give at the Bell, utterly unaware that 2 floors of Goldman Sachs were about to convene an emergency call about the woman he hadn't looked at while firing. He still had no idea. He thought the worst thing that had happened to me yesterday was losing my job. He didn't know that the worst thing that had happened was to him, and that it had happened the moment he assumed a signature was just a formality, and that the woman attached to it was just furniture. The phone buzzed again, face down on the table, humming against the wood. I turned it over. This time it wasn't Goldman. It was the general counsel of Helix Therapeutics. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Not for drama, but because I wanted to be fully calm before I spoke a single word to anyone from that building. This is Sloane. Sloane, it's Robert Keene. The general counsel. A careful man, ordinarily. The kind of lawyer who'd spent a career making other people's recklessness disappear quietly. But there was no quiet in his voice this morning. There was the brittle, over-controlled politeness of a man standing in a room that had just caught fire. I hope you're doing all right. I'm sorry about how yesterday was handled. I want you to know I wasn't, that some of those decisions were made above my recommendation. I noted that. The lawyers always know which way the wind is turning before anyone else, and they always start building their own exits first. Robert was already distancing himself from a decision he'd sat silently beside 24 hours earlier. What can I do for you, Robert? I'll be straight with you. We've had There's been a question raised by our underwriting partners about the regulatory certification on the lead asset, specifically about the authorized signatory of record. A pause. The sound of a man choosing words the way you choose stones to cross a river, which, as you know, is you. It is, I said. We're hoping to resolve this cleanly. The board would like to discuss an arrangement to keep the certification current through the offering. We're prepared to be accommodating. We'd want you to re execute the compliance certification before Thursday's pricing, and in exchange, we can revisit the terms of your separation. Substantially revisit them. There it was, exactly as Margot had predicted, almost to the syllable. Make this fast and quiet. Dangle the severance. Hope she panics. I did not panic. I had stopped panicking somewhere around the 12th block of that freezing walk home. Robert, I said pleasantly, I think any conversation about my re executing a federal compliance certification needs to happen between counsel. I've retained representation. I'll have my attorney reach out to coordinate. I'm sure you understand. A silence. Then, quieter, the politeness thinning. Sloane, I want to be helpful here, but I'd encourage you to understand the urgency. Without a current certification, Thursday doesn't happen. A lot of people are counting on Thursday. And there it was. The pivot every cornered institution makes. The appeal to a lot of people. As if the 400 employees whose options were riding on this deal had been on Marcus's mind yesterday when he tried to strip mine. As if the urgency were somehow my obligation to absorb, my crisis to fix, the way every crisis at Helix had always quietly become mine. I understand the urgency completely, I said. I understood it on Tuesday, when I raised the single signatory risk and recommended a redundancy, and was told, less cooks, cleaner kitchen. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. My attorney will be in touch this morning. Her name is Margot Lindqvist. I think you'll find she's very familiar with the certification. I heard him write the name down. I heard more specifically the pen stop moving partway through it. Because Robert Keene, unlike Marcus Vale, knew exactly who Margot Lindqvist was. He knew she'd been on the government side of that original certification. He knew that of every attorney in Manhattan I could possibly have called, I had called the one person alive who understood the regulatory architecture of his problem better than anyone at his own firm. I see, he said. And he did. For the first time in the conversation, I think he genuinely did. What happened over the next 8 hours, I learned only in pieces, the way you reconstruct a storm from the damage. Margot called Robert before 10. By 11, Goldman's underwriting committee had formally flagged the certification defect and notified Helix that pricing could not proceed Thursday, absent a valid current certification executed by an authorized officer in good standing. A category that, as of Monday morning, by Marcus's own hand, contained exactly 0 people. By noon, the underwriters had used a word that turns CEOs to ash, postpone. By 1 o'clock, the postponement had a cost attached, because in the world of public offerings, delay is never free. Market windows close. Comparable companies move. The model Goldman had built, the $4 billion valuation that depended on launching into a specific, favorable window. All of it began to erode by the hour, and every hour had a number. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the board finally understood what their CEO had actually done. I know the precise moment, because Daniel Cho told me later in his dry managing director way, and because by then I was no longer reconstructing the storm from outside. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was being asked, formally through counsel, with the deference reserved for people who hold all the cards, to come to the Helix offices the next morning. Not to clean out a desk, to attend a meeting of the board. I almost said no. There was nothing I needed in that building. But Margot talked me through it, and her reasoning was the same as mine had always been. When the truth is finally going to be said out loud, you want to be standing in the room you chose, in front of the people who need to see it. Not because revenge requires an audience, because accountability does. So on a gray Wednesday morning, 3 days after they'd walked me out, I walked back in. Same lobby, same slow elevator, same engineered silence on the 44th floor. The receptionist who'd watched security escort me out on Monday now stood when she saw me and didn't quite know what to do with her hands. They'd assembled in the main boardroom, the one with the view of the East River, the long glass table, the chairs that cost more than the receptionist's monthly rent. The full board. Robert Keene, pale and rigid, Daniel Cho and a second banker from Goldman, faces carefully blank, Diane from HR, who could not meet my eyes. And at the head of the table, Marcus Vale, whose famous tan had gone a strange, waxy color under the recessed lighting. And beside him, looking like he wanted to be anywhere on earth, the nephew. The chairman of the board, a silver-haired man named Howard Glass, who I'd briefed perhaps a dozen times over the years and who had never once until this moment looked at me as though I were a person, gestured to the empty chair across from Marcus. Ms. Whitfield, thank you for coming, please. I sat. I set my folder on the glass, the same folder, the same gesture as Monday, and I watched Marcus's eyes go to it and flinch. I think, Howard began, there's been a significant misunderstanding regarding the company's structure, and we're hoping to. There's no misunderstanding, I said, calmly, not unkindly. I understand the structure perfectly. I designed most of it. I opened the folder. I think what's happened is that, until yesterday, no one at the head of this table had read it. No one spoke. Marcus opened his mouth and Howard lifted a single finger off the glass. A small, brutal gesture. The kind a chairman uses when he has stopped entirely listening to his CEO. Mr. Cho, Howard said quietly, not taking his eyes off me, would you state for the board plainly where the offering stands? Daniel Cho cleared his throat. The offering cannot price as scheduled. The lead assets compliance certification, which the S1 represents as current and accurate, and which our underwriting is built upon, was executed by an authorized officer of the company who is no longer employed by the company, as of Monday morning. There is no other authorized signatory of record. We were not informed of the termination. We learned of it, the faintest pause, through the market. And the consequence, Howard said. Without a valid certification, we cannot proceed Thursday. Each day of delay carries material cost and risk to the valuation, and the commission will require an explanation for the change in signatory status. He folded his hands. Candidly, it raises governance questions that go beyond the certification itself. Governance questions that go beyond the certification itself. The most genteel sentence in the English language, for we are now wondering whether your CEO should be running anything at all. And then Marcus, because men like Marcus cannot sit inside a silence that is condemning them, finally spoke. This is absurd, he said, and his voice had the wrong volume for the room, too loud, the volume of panic pretending to be authority. She's holding the company hostage. She got walked out for performance, and now she's weaponizing a paperwork technicality to extort us. We can reassign the certification. We can... You cannot, Margot said. She had been so quiet beside me that I think half the room had forgotten she was there. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The certification is not a title you can reassign with an internal memo, Mr. Vale. It is a federal authorization tied to a named, vetted individual. Reassigning it requires a qualified officer, a re-vetting process, and time you do not have before Thursday. I know this because I reviewed the original certification from the government side 11 months ago. There is no version of this where you simply hand it to someone else by Friday. She let it land. Ms. Whitfield isn't holding anything hostage. She left. You created the vacancy. The structure is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Marcus's mouth worked silently. The waxy color in his face had deepened, and I watched. I will not pretend I didn't feel something, watching it. The precise instant the truth arrived behind his eyes. The realization that he had not fired a department head to take her shares. He had pulled the single bolt out of his own $4 billion machine, walked away whistling, and was only now hearing the sound of it coming down. He turned to me. For the first time in 18 months, Marcus Vale actually looked at my face. Sloane, he said, and the name came out cracked. What do you want? The whole room turned with him. Howard Glass, the bankers, Robert, Diane, the nephew, who had not said one word and never would. Every face that had decided, on Monday, that I was furniture. All of them now waiting, completely still, to hear what the furniture wanted. I closed the folder, and I told them. What I wanted was not what any of them expected, and that was the first thing that changed the temperature of the room. They were braced for a number. I could see it in the way the bankers had gone still, and the way Howard Glass had quietly slid a legal pad in front of himself, pen uncapped, ready to write down whatever ransom I named. They had decided what kind of woman I was, the kind who'd been humiliated and would now extract her pound of flesh in dollars, loudly, the way Marcus would have. It is a particular arrogance of people like Marcus to assume everyone else is exactly as small as they are. I want three things, I said. None of them are negotiable, and all of them are reasonable, which I imagine will be a novel combination for this table. Howard's pen hovered. First, the forfeiture clause in the separation agreement Mr. Vale handed me on Monday, the one structured to strip my vested equity and options the moment I signed, is void, and we will execute a corrected separation that honors my equity exactly as it was earned and vested. I'm not asking for more than I'm owed. I'm declining to be robbed. There's a difference, and I'd like the minutes to reflect that I had to explain it. Robert Keene was writing fast now and nodding, the relief of a lawyer who has just been handed a request he can actually fulfill. Second, my departure stands. I'm not coming back as an employee of this company. I watched Marcus's face do something complicated at that. He'd assumed the entire exercise was a maneuver to claw my job back with a raise, because that's what he would have done. I have no interest in working under this leadership, and I think after this week, you understand that the feeling is structurally mutual. Then the certification, Howard began. I'm getting to the certification. I let the pause do its work. Third, I will execute a one-time compliance certification to allow the offering to proceed, if and only if it is done correctly, which means it will be done through my counsel, under a properly documented engagement as an independent regulatory consultant, at a consultant's rate for that specific scope. Not as a favor, not under an employment relationship that no longer exists. And it will be done only after the corrected separation is signed, my equity is secured, and I turned for the first time directly to Howard Glass, because this was the part that mattered most and the part Marcus could not be allowed to control. After this board has independently addressed the governance failure that created this entire situation, because Mr. Cho is right, the certification was never the real problem. The real problem is sitting at the head of this table. The silence that followed was the kind that reorganizes a room permanently. I want to be clear about what I had just done, because it was the whole point, and it was the opposite of what they'd feared. I had not held the company hostage. I had handed them the solution. The offering could proceed. The 400 employees with options would get their day. The $4 billion would not evaporate. I'd simply attached one condition that no amount of money could buy and that Marcus could not pay his way out of. That the people who let this happen had to look directly at how it had happened, on the record, in front of the bank. Howard Glass set down his pen. Ms. Whitfield, he said slowly, would you and your counsel give the board the room for a few minutes? Margot and I waited in my old office. The nephew's furniture catalog was still open on what used to be my desk. I didn't touch anything. I stood at the window and looked at the river, and Margot stood beside me, and neither of us said a word, because there was nothing left to say. The work was done. The truth had been spoken in the room I'd chosen. Everything after this was just the institution doing what institutions do when the cost of protecting one man finally exceeds the cost of removing him. It took the board 40 minutes. When they called us back in, Marcus Vale was no longer at the head of the table. He was no longer at the table at all. The nephew's chair was empty too. I learned the specifics later, the way you always do. Marcus had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a governance review. The polite phrase for a man whose remaining time is measured in news cycles. The board had concluded, with Goldman watching, that a CEO who fired his sole regulatory signatory 3 days before an offering structured the firing to strip her vested equity and failed to inform the underwriters was not a CEO they could take public. The market does not forgive that kind of judgment, and boards, in the end, answer to the market. Howard Glass remained standing. The board accepts your terms, he said. All three. A pause, and then something I had genuinely not expected. He inclined his head, slightly, the way one professional acknowledges another. And the board would like to note, for the record, that the structural risk you identified 11 months ago was correct, and that it was a failure of this company's leadership not to heed it. That note will appear in the minutes. You have my word. It was a small thing, a line in a document most people would never read. But I had spent 3 years watching my work get absorbed into other people's victories, my warnings waved off, my name left off the page. And here was the chairman of the board in front of the bank, putting my name back on it, not as a courtesy, but as a correction. I signed the certification 4 days later, through Margot, as an independent consultant for a fee that reflected what the work was actually worth, which is to say, considerably more than the $9,000 bonus they'd once tried to chisel me out of, and a great deal more than the severance designed to make me disappear. The offering priced the following week into a slightly worse window, at a slightly lower valuation, the cost of Marcus's 3 days, paid by the company that had kept him over my objection. My equity converted exactly as it had been earned. The number, when it settled, was the kind that ends one chapter of a life and quietly opens another. I won't say it here, it was never about the number. Marcus Vale's resignation was announced as a decision to step down to pursue other opportunities, the standard obituary for a career that has ended badly. The trade press ran it for a day. No one mentioned me, which was exactly as it should be. I had not done this to be seen. I had done it because the alternative was to let them be right about me, to be the furniture, the assistant, the dead weight, the name not worth reading. And I have never, not once, been willing to be those things. A few weeks after it all settled, an email arrived from Diane in HR. I didn't know what was in those papers when I sat in that room. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I read it twice. I believe she was sincere. It changed nothing. She had been a symptom, not the cause. But I wrote back 2 lines because cruelty is a choice, and so is its opposite. I believe you. Take care of yourself, Diane. Then I closed the laptop and didn't think about it again. People ask me when I tell this story whether I felt triumphant standing in that boardroom. The honest answer is no. What I felt was clear. Triumph is loud and it fades. Clarity is quiet and it stays. I had spent 6 years believing that if I just worked hard enough, was indispensable enough, held the whole machine together with both hands long enough, the people at the top would eventually see my worth and reward it freely. That belief was the most expensive thing I ever owned. What I learned, in the space between an elevator on Monday and a boardroom on Wednesday, is that your value is never proven by how much you can quietly carry. It's proven the moment you set the weight down and discover that you were the only one holding it up the entire time. They thought my signature was a formality. It turned out my signature was the company, and the woman attached to it was never, for one single second, the furniture they took her for.